Welcome down to my 9-foot homemade oak bar. Pour yourself a cold one. You are listening to Bucs in the Basement. My name's Chris, and Craig here is the biggest Pirates fan you'll ever meet. Let's talk Pirates baseball now. Welcome to Bucs in the Basement.
Now I see the changes in this town. They change, they say one thing, but then the next day it's different. They change, but they don't know what they want. All they do is change. Going left, going right, travel day, travel night. That's where we'll go. No excuses, no goodbyes, no one cries, no one lies. We'll never know.
All right, guys, I'm doing what every sane Pittsburgh fan is doing during the Steeler bye week is I'm thinking about the Pirates because I guess that's what I always do. And before we get into the off season here, because the World Series is still going on, the Pirates have been waiting for a month to make any realistic moves, I thought I would take this opportunity to bring in a guest, never been on the show before, but somebody I met up with at a Pirate game back in August and said he would jump on. And so, guys, I'm bringing you Andrew Fillipponi from the Fan 93.7 at the Poni Express, taking the opportunity to drive back home with the Steelers on the bye week and is nice enough to come and talk depressing Pirate stuff with me. Andrew, how you doing today, brother?
Craig, not bad. Yeah, I'm a man of my word. I probably went to about a half dozen games, and if you want to find me at a Pirates game, that's probably your best bet, is out at that center field bar.
Yeah, and it used to be better. I mean, I know, Andrew, you moved to Pittsburgh, I believe it was in 2010, so you didn't get the Three Rivers Stadium days where we could, just basically pay $5 for a ticket and sit wherever we want. The prices have gone up a little bit since then.
Yeah, I hear some great stories about Three Rivers and people doing stuff like that. They would know an usher that have a friend of a friend or a family member who would get them down into great seats if you just made sure that you tipped them a little bit. So I always love stuff like that. Look, this is a capitalistic society. People got to make their money somehow. I love a good usher. Ushers that hook it up for customers and fans. I'm always a big fan of those people too.
Oh yeah, man. It's and there still might be some of those guys out there, but there's a little bit more expensive seats, and it's at least like, I don't know, about $20 to get in there, unless you're buying it from a scalper on the street.
Sure.
Yes.
Tickets to be half, Craig.
Yeah.
Last year, definitely.
Yeah, especially towards the end of the season. I mean, like when people are saying like walk up, I mean you could walk up and pretty much sit anywhere you wanted to. Yep, absolutely. And here's the funny thing is Andrew, I know you get like kind of like a bad rap on Twitter on the stuff that you speak about the Pirates, but I was even just going back through your Twitter feed and just search Pirates, and a lot of the stuff was just more frustration. And when you came into Pittsburgh, it was right at the end of the last rebuild, and stuff started to get good. So your first few years in Pittsburgh here were really good for the Pirates.
Yeah, starting in 2011 when they were buyers at the trade deadline, and they fizzled out in August and September, but they were good for half of that season. They were right in the thick of things. They made that Derek Lee trade with Chicago. They made the Ryan Ludwig trade with San Diego, and there was a lot of optimism that carried over into 2012 and the September collapse 2.0. And, of course, the magical years that were 2013, 14, and 15, which did not have a ton of postseason success, but 94, 88, 98 win teams. So it was fun. It showed that even as a small market or one of the lowest spending teams in Major League Baseball, that where there's a will, there's a way. You can feel the competitive team, a more than competitive team. So, yeah, I get nostalgic about those games. It was disappointing when they would lose in the playoffs, and then maybe the off seasons didn't go the way that you wanted them to, as Pirates fans, hoping that the team would add a little bit more to those teams. But what I wouldn't give to go back in time and relive those 3 seasons again, because they were so great. And you hope that the pain and the misery and the suffering that's going on right now will lead to a payoff with something like that maybe 2 or 3 years from now.
Yeah, and that's where we're kind of like in that, I don't even know if I would call it a holding pattern, but it's just kind of like stagnant. When Ben Cherington came in, there was, a lot of excitement, a lot of just, anticipation of what the future could hold, what was going to happen. Unfortunately, 2020 was not good for anybody. I mean, the pandemic year, shortened season, didn't get to see, anybody really make up for how bad they were playing. Brian Reynolds had a down year. Josh Bell, everybody had a down year all at the same time. But you thought that there was maybe, something on the horizon beyond that, and it's been 2 100-loss seasons with pretty much the same plan, or the same, I guess it would be plan of attack, is waiver wire pickups, reclamation projects, and, at least a little bit more of playing the young guys.
Yeah. Well, they didn't do enough of that last point this season for me. I thought that they should have really committed stronger to playing their young guys earlier in the year. And I thought by the time they really got going with that, Craig, it was so late in the year that people had already kind of checked out on them, unless you're a real diehard, of which there are Pirates fans that come close to watching all 162 and listening to their games. And that's great for us as a radio station because we air their games, but I'm not naive or ignorant to the fact that there just are not a lot of fans left who are that hardcore. So the gains that they made in September with a lot of young guys in the lineup, a lot of fans missed out on that because they had already moved into football season. So that's kind of, in my opinion, one of the things they screwed up a little bit this last year. I mean, I didn't have any false pretenses or misgivings. I figured when Cherington got hired that he thought or would think the best thing for them would be to pretty much strip it bare and rebuild from the bottom and go from there and try to get as many young prospects through the draft and trades where you got more prospects back. Like, I expected that. I think what I'm concerned about, Craig, more than anything else, is I don't know if the trades they've made for young players and the draft picks they made are going to produce the types of building block guys that they had back when they made the playoffs in 13, 14, and 15. I'm a little bit worried about that. I think they had the right idea. I think that's probably the only way to win in Pittsburgh when you're committed to being a small market team. But I'm really worried about the payoff in terms of the guys that they used those picks on and the players that they got back as prospects in some of their bigger trades, Craig.
Did see at one point in time that you mentioned like the Cleveland Guardians rebuild, and it was a very quick rebuild. I mean, it's pretty much been since around like 2018, 2019, which would be, right around the time that ours kind of started. Because I always tell people that Huntington started a rebuild before he left. He never finished that rebuild. And then Cherington basically said, yeah, we just got to take this thing down to the studs. So, I mean, technically, if you go back to the Garrett Cole trade, the Andrew McCutchen trade, where that rebuild was starting, then yeah, maybe the Pirates did start, right around the same time or right before Cleveland.
And I think time has been kinder to those two trades now. They were public relations disasters. The only thing that kind of made the pain and sting of those deals a little easier for fans is that they happened in January, right when the Steelers were in the playoffs. And they didn't. No, it's serious. I want to say one of those trades happened in the middle of the Steelers-Jaguars playoff game.
Yeah.
Like, that was time. You can go back and look that up. It might have been the Garrett Cole trade happened at the exact moment that game was going on. But, you got Brian Reynolds back from McCutchen, and you got Joe Musgrove back in the Cole trade. Now, Musgrove didn't really take off until he went to San Diego, his hometown. But you got a younger pitcher who was a top, maybe not an ace, but was close to a top-of-the-rotation guy. So, in hindsight, those weren't bad trades. It was just that they did not get enough out of Musgrove in Pittsburgh, and then they flipped him again, and in that trade, they didn't get enough back, which that's more on this regime than it is on Huntington. So, I'm not excusing Huntington the last couple of years. I thought he deserved to get fired. But even those moves that, cost the Pirates a lot of fans. A lot of people canceled their season tickets and said they'd never go back after those two deals. They were honestly, in the McCutchen case, it was objectively a really good trade, Craig. And the Garrett Cole trade, in hindsight, doesn't look as bad.
Yeah, and that's where it's just like the more of the almost like visceral reaction and emotion from Pirates fans, and not realizing, but like with the Cleveland Guardians trades to build their team, I know that Chris and I, when we talk, we've been focusing a lot on, the collateral that the Pirates had to make their trades. The Cleveland Guardians had Corey Kluber, Trevor Bauer, Mike Clevenger, Lindor. The Pirates had, after the McCutchen and after the Garrett Cole trades, which I feel like that was kind of like their pinnacle of maybe they should have gotten more back, but they don't look as bad in hindsight. But, we were trading Josh Bell on a down year. We traded Adam Frazier, who had the best first half of his career, but everybody kind of knew who Adam Frazier was. We traded Joe Musgrove before, we saw little bits and pieces of what he could be, but just not for an entire full season. So it's just basically just not having the same collateral as some of these teams.
Well, it kind of reminds me of when Huntington first took over the Pirates. He made a lot of trades. And many of those trades really did not have the intended result. For example, the Jason Bay trade. The best player the Pirates got back in that deal was Brandon Moss. But again, he didn't start to play well until he left the Pirates, until he went to the A's and he went to the Red Sox and played for those teams. You had a really good player. You made a blockbuster deal. You were a part of one. You really didn't get anything out of them. He made a minor trade. I think it might have been he traded Graybow to Chicago, and he got Josh Harrison thrown into a deal. That was a great trade. But the deals like, well, I guess even I'm thinking about it now, he traded Nate McLeod. He got Charlie Morton back in the deal.
Yeah.
But if you go back and you look at most of the supposed big trade chips that Huntington had in his first couple of years, that they did not get players back in those deals that led to 13, 14, and 15 being great seasons. If you look at those teams, Marte, they signed. McCutchen was drafted. Walker was drafted. Alvarez was drafted. Cole was drafted. Burnett was a salary dump by the Yankees. Liriano, great signing. Martin, great signing. It's not as if the trades they made while rebuilding, Craig, made them a great team.
Yeah.
So you're right. You're right to say Cleveland, they got two not all-stars, but they got two starting players back for Lindor. Their starting middle infield is Rosario, and the second baseman's head's escaping me here. But they got two starting players back for Lindor. Combined, they're better players. So kudos to the Guardians for doing that. But even the last time the Pirates did a successful rebuild, it wasn't really because of the players that they traded. It was more the guys that they drafted and more the guys they signed in free agency on the cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where it's like, I mean, there is no correct way or right way or, blueprint to complete a rebuild. I just think that a lot of people, when Cherington came in, were like, he's doing this different because he's, trading for these lottery ticket guys, these high-end guys, and that hoping that they will work out. Well, we know when you look at prospect lists and it's like a high-risk trade or a high-risk player that, he could boom, but, man, that there is just as much chance that he could bust.
If you ever see me out and about in Pittsburgh, you will always recognize me, and not just because of the white beard, but also because of the Y that is always on top of my head, the hat I always wear. The Yins brand, proud partners with Bucs in the Basement. 3 dynasties, 1 brand, Yins. Finally, 1 brand to rep all black and gold. Follow at Shop Yins for new merch drops and giveaways. Order online at www.shopyins, the emphasis on the 2 Z's, high quality comfort, lightweight materials, a new modern look for the black and gold, made for Yins by a Yinzer.
Exactly. And, I think that one of the other aspects of, trying to get to that point where we're super invested in the season and we think that the Pirates can actually do something with expanded playoffs, and it's easier to make the playoffs now than it ever has been before. We saw what the Phillies have done as the last team in. But, I think everybody started 2022 like, hey, let's just see these core players make strides. Let's just see them take steps towards being really good major league players. And that's why the Brian Hayes thing, I know he was a Gold Glove finalist, whip-de-doo. He's a really good defensive player. But I'm super disappointed in what he did offensively. What is so bizarre to me, Craig, is that this Pirates regime has had a reputation because they know they're not winning right now. They don't really want to. They've been so careful with injuries in protecting players that when Hayes came out at the end of the year and basically said, I played the entire year hurt, that's why my offensive numbers were so bad. Well, what the hell is that all about? Which one is it? Are they shutting guys down and protecting guys because, there's a bigger picture in mind? Or are they kind of taking more of a tough love, go out there and play every day approach? I just found those comments, it felt like Hayes wanted to make excuses for the season that he had. And the problem with that, Craig, is that for a lot of casual fans, the biggest memory or the biggest thing they'll remember about him this year is the stupid sunflower seed thing. And so I just think, like, it compounds things when there's a lack of hustle play that everybody sees, and then you make an excuse for yourself at the end of the year. I don't know. I wanted to leave 2022 thinking that Brian Hayes was going to be a star player, and I have my doubts about that now.
Yeah, and I with me, everybody knows my stance on Brian Hayes. I think that Brian Hayes offensively can only get a little bit better. Just from watching him in the minors and taking out that, unbelievable September at the end of 2020, Brian Hayes has always been a fairly average offensive player. And that's almost all that you can really ask for. It's just been that when the Pirates have made signings previously, with Andrew McCutchen and extending him, Andrew McCutchen became an MVP player. Starling Marte, when they extend him, Starling Marte becomes, the right-hand man to Andrew McCutchen and is just like one of the best players on your team, and an all-star. You're hoping for the same thing with Polanco before he got injured, instead of making I don't know, we've almost called it it's spending a lot for the Pirates, but it's actually a fairly safe way to guarantee around 4 wins above replacement every single season.
Yeah. And I hear that, and I think that you can live with Hayes. I'll take Hayes if Cruz gives me above average offensive production at shortstop. Ideally, when you build a team, the traditional way is that the offense comes from third and the defense comes from short.
Yeah.
Well, if it's flipped and your shortstop doesn't kill you defensively and he puts up big, giant numbers, and your third baseman plays defense like Nolan Arenado, I have an easier time accepting that, because at the end of the day, you're getting what you want from those two positions. It's just kind of flipped. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
If Brian Hayes was a shortstop, he'd be like Andrelton Simmons or somebody like that, where, you hit your 250 or 260 with 13 home runs and a 725 OPS. I'll take that because you're saving runs for me every game. But it's different when it's a third baseman. You always want to be great up the middle defensively. Shortstop is by far, they've done studies on it. Shortstop and catcher are by far the two most important defensive positions, by far. And third base is probably fourth behind center field. So I don't really agree with paying a premium for third base defense, but you made a good point. You're really not when you compare it to what other teams are paying for the analytics of what Hayes gives you in totality at third base.
Yeah, and it's the big thing is that, the way that Cherington's, trying to gather wins and not doing it in some ways, and not doing it in the regular fashion or the way that everybody else does it. But Andrew, I want to go back to, if this year is, another quote unquote, they're just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
Then you only have 2 more years of Brian Reynolds in center field. And I've heard everybody saying he's not being traded this offseason. He's staying here. He's going to be here in 2023. But then my question is, are we just hoping for a great year from Brian Reynolds so he can get a nice trade return in 2024, the offseason?
Yeah, I would have said to you, probably when Cruz got called up and it looked like some of these young players, Contreras at the major league level, I think I got excited when they had their mid-season spurt there. Hey, you still have arbitration years with this guy. Keep him around. But it's a real struggle for me when Henry Davis basically had a throwaway year. Nick Gonzalez had a throwaway year. I think Paguero's good, but I think he's probably just a guy defensively that moves, maybe Cruz to another position. I think he'll be a pretty good shortstop. I'm not going to put, a huge label on him. But I just don't, Priester too, I'll throw in there as a, hopefully a top of the rotation guy. But Craig, correct me if I'm wrong, but outside of like Rodriguez, who was such a revelation this year, and Burrows had a good year too, the guys that were regarded as the Pirates' top prospects, like none of them had great minor league seasons.
No, it's
none of them had a year that's like, oh crap, this guy's knocking down the door to get called up early next year. Nobody did that. So because that didn't happen, I think you've got to be more aggressive about looking for what you can get back in a trade for Brian Reynolds, because 2023 just doesn't seem like a year where the young players click and, hey, if things go, you can be the Guardians next year. Like, I just don't see that potential now for them, because none of those guys that you really are pinning your hopes to really took a big step forward in 2022.
If it's Wednesday night, I'm grabbing the mic. If it's Sunday, I'm grabbing some wings, watching the Steeler game. Baseball's in the off-season, but there is no off-season at Patrick's Pub and Grill. Patrick's Pub and Grill, 1207 Spring Run Road Extension, Moon Township, PA, 15108. Daily drink specials. So sit down on the patio, grab yourself a beer, and enjoy.
Yeah, and you're almost, if you're hoping for like a Guardians-type turnaround, I don't have a lot of hope for that for when we're discussing that this offseason, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, it's sounding like that this offseason is going to be a lot like the previous offseasons.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, if Gonzalez and Davis had huge years at Altoona, and the thought was they're going to start the year at AAA, and maybe they'll be up in June or July, and you've got like the Orioles catcher, what's his name, Adley Rutschman or something like that. Like the season they had this past year. If you thought those guys they're almost here, look out. They're not going to break camp. They're not going to come north with the team out of spring training, but just wait a couple of months and these guys will be here. Then I'd say it makes sense to keep Reynolds. Give a young team a shot. Don't get rid of their best all-around player. But I don't know, man. Reynolds came on enough in the second half of the season where I think I would want to try to sell high with him. So that's where I'm at with Reynolds right now. And I've been on the record about that with Bednar too.
Oh, and I was about to bring him up, and me and you are like probably the only people in Pittsburgh that are on the same page when it comes to that. As soon as Bednar started having like the little bit of the back issue, I was like, I love the dude. It's a great story. I love when Renegade plays at the game. I love his fire. He's doing beer bongs at Steeler games with Steeler fans. Like, I'm just like, this guy is Pittsburgh. But he's also a potential elite closer on a 100-loss team.
Yep. Exactly. And it's been proven. The Pirates, just look at them year by year. They'll find somebody to get 3 outs at the end of the game. Outside of kind of an outlier year here and there, whether it's Jose Mesa or Mike Williams for a year or two, or Joel Hanrahan or Mark Melancon or Jason Grilly, they'll find somebody to get those last 3 outs. And the only reason why it's even, in my opinion, a debate or discussion is because of all the points you just made.
Yeah.
And that's one where, the front office has to weigh a decision that might temporarily offend the paying customer. I understand he's got family here and friends. That's great. that they get to see his games the same way Neil Walker's family did, etc. But nobody builds their team around a closer. And outside of the people that are close to David Bednar, nobody buys tickets to go see a guy pitch the ninth inning.
And potentially pitch the ninth inning. Potentially.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing is I mean, it's just like how there's games where it's like, okay, David Bednar, he needs to pitch this week because there hasn't been a save opportunity for, over a week, or so we gotta get him into this game. And you can't really play Renegade when you're down 8-2 in the eighth inning, and he's coming in just to get work.
Yeah, and you also have to, and nobody wants to hear this because he's a great guy. He's a super dude. I like David Bednar, the person, a lot. Okay? But let's remember, he was a late round pick from Lehigh. He was not a top prospect. When the Pirates traded for him, they never imagined that he would ever have this kind of season.
He was a throw-in.
Right. So, repeat performance in sports, it can happen. But we've seen with relief pitchers, there's no get. We might have already seen the best David Bednar has to offer. That's why I wanted them to trade him so badly last year. You got to strike while the iron's hot with guys like that. And I just felt like they let the sentimental stuff, him being an all-star, him being from Pittsburgh, I just felt like from the outside looking in that they let that interfere with their decision-making around the trade deadline.
Yeah, and Andrew, before I let you go here, I just wanted to go back to one other thing that you said that has now sent me into a deep Pirates depression for the rest of the offseason, is that when you were like, okay, like Liover Peguero, which Chris and I during the last show kind of brought up, like the poor season that he had, we're hoping for more offensively. Defensively, the guy is going to be just fine. The scouts, I'm hearing that. So now, if we move O'Neal Cruz, or he gets moved off of shortstop, and you have a defensive-minded third baseman, a defensive-minded shortstop, we were okay earlier in our discussion with having Cruz make up for, the lack of offense at third base. But now if you have a whole left side of the field that is just all defensive-minded, and then possibly, I've heard things about like a G1 Bay move to center field and getting, Reynolds to an outfield corner. Where is this offense coming from?
Well, they don't have any power whatsoever. There's no power. I actually think I understand that you wanted a guy with some team control that was a younger pitcher that you thought might have some upside, who was having a good year, even though he's not a young guy, Holderman. But I really don't get the Vogelback trade. Nobody cared when it got made. There was a lot of ambivalence to that trade. It was like, all right, you just kind of expected it. But I don't think there was enough said about his team option for this year.
Yeah.
I think it's $1.5 million.
And you basically created a hole where you didn't have to create a hole, and you basically let him play DH when the man the year before played a decent amount of games at first base for the Brewers, and you just let him be the DH. We were saying before the year, if you brought in Yoshi and you brought in Vogelback, I'm fine with that, because you're hoping that at least one of those works out to cover for the next year because you have nobody else coming up. Well, now you've created a hole that never needed to be created.
Right. And I just don't. Holderman, shocking thing about that trade, too, was I think he was not that win-loss record means much of anything, but he was 4-0 with the Mets, a good team, and you got him and you sent him right down to Indianapolis. The circumstances, and then what they did once that trade was made with the player, I still don't really understand much. So Vogelback, we know what he is. He's a 3 true outcome guy. Not much defensively, but he's a lefty with a short porch that can pop home runs at PNC Park.
Yeah.
And he was super cheap. You just gave that away.
Yeah, and I said,
go ahead.
I said the only way that trade makes sense to me is if they build Holderman back up and give him a shot to start like they did for Zach Thompson, like they're doing for Johan Oviedo. People that, he came up through the system as a starter and had transitioned to the bullpen, and that's the only way that trade made sense to me. And if that's not the route they were taking, then to trade him when you had him under control for another year for a bullpen piece makes absolutely no sense.
No. And so, it's obvious based on the way you just laid it out that at least right now, they see themselves as going to win with pitching and fielding, but you've got to find a way to manufacture some easy runs.
Yeah.
And I don't see that in their organization now. Maybe you want to say with the electric strikes, with the computerized strike zone eventually coming in, with the shifting rules, that maybe teams that hit for contact, in the next 2 or 3 years will have a better chance than they do now. But that's really hard to forecast, and I don't really think they're thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. Power is expensive. It's really hard to get. For a team like the Pirates, you really have to just draft it. And I just don't see enough of it in the pipeline. So, yeah, I understand where your depression's coming from, Craig, because just talking it out with you right now kind of paints a pretty bleak picture as far as that goes, and that's the name of the game right now. You got to be able to hit home runs.
Yeah, you got to get your offense someplace, and like you said, it's almost just like the quick, get the runs back instead of having to work and steal and do all kinds of other stuff. I understand if even if they are thinking a couple steps ahead, it's gambling that the game is going to move the way that you think it's going to move. And if it doesn't, then you're left with a team with no power, fairly decent defense, and guys that can maybe get on base, and you're hoping you can pitch your way to the playoffs. Because once you get to the playoffs, as we've seen, it's always reverts back to, home runs are king, but pitching is it's like 1A and 1B in the playoffs.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, Shelton and the people that he has working underneath him, I think the last couple of months, at least from the outsider's perspective, probably saved those guys. Keller's progression, not that Marine gets really a lot of credit for that, but, he looks like he's now at least moving, relatively speaking, in the right direction. A guy like Castro coming on late in the year, Cruz putting a lot of it together, kind of saved the hitting coach's backside. But I do think it'll be one of the storylines to me of the Pirates offseason, Craig, will be if they give Shelton an extension.
Oh, that's, man.
Because if they don't, I'm going to go on the record right now with you. I will be stunned if they don't give him a 1 or 2 year extension, because all they've said are positive things about him. Sherrington talks about how much he loves working with the guy.
He's a great partner.
If you make him go into if you make him go into the final year of his contract, then you're pretty much telling the guy, I got to see something from you. I need better results. We need to see progress. And their statements, their public statements would say they love the job he's doing and that they would reward him with something that doesn't kind of put him under a microscope and put him on the hot seat going into the season.